Section 15 of the Chemistry of Cookery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio. The Chemistry of Cookery by W. Mattieu Williams. Count Rumford's Cookery and Cheap Dinners. I must not leave the subject of vegetable cookery without describing Count Rumford's achievements in feeding the paupers, rogues, and vagabonds of Munich. An account of this is the more desirable from the fact that the soup which formed the basis of his dietary is still misunderstood in this country, for reasons that I shall presently state. After reorganizing the Bavarian army, not only as regards military discipline, but in the feeding, clothing, education, and useful employment of the men, in order to make them good citizens as well as good soldiers, he attacked a still more difficult problem, that of removing from Bavaria the scandal and burden of the hordes of beggars and thieves which had become intolerable. He tells us that the number of itinerant beggars of both sexes and all ages, as well foreigners as natives, who strolled about the country in all directions, levying contributions from the industrious inhabitants, stealing and robbing, and leading a life of indolence and most shameless debauchery, was quite incredible, and further, that these detestable vermin swarmed everywhere, and not only their impudence and clamorous importunity were without any bounds, but they had recourse to the most diabolical acts and most horrid crimes in the prosecution of their infamous trade. Young children were stolen from their parents by these wretches, and their eyes put out, or their tender limbs broken and distorted, in order, by exposing them thus maimed, to excite the pity and commiseration of the public. He gives further particulars of their trading upon the misery of their own children, and their organization to obtain alms by systematic intimidation. Previous attempts to cure the evil had failed, the public had lost all faith in further projects, and therefore no support was to be expected for Rumford's scheme. Aware of this, he says, I took my measures accordingly. To convince the public that the scheme was feasible, I determined first, by a great exertion, to carry it into complete execution, and then to ask them to support it. He describes the military organization by which he distributed the army throughout the country districts to capture all the strolling provincial beggars, and how, on January 1st, 1790, he bagged all the beggars of Munich in less than an hour by means of a well-organized civil and military battue, New Year's Day being the great festival when all the beggars went abroad to enforce their customary blackmail upon the industrious section of the population. Though very interesting, I must not enter upon these details, but cannot help stepping a little aside from my proper subject to quote his weighty words on the ethical principles upon which he proceeded. He says that, with persons of this description, it is easy to be conceived that precepts, admonitions, and punishments would be of little avail, but where precepts fail, habits may sometimes be successful. To make vicious and abandoned people happy, it has generally been supposed necessary, first, to make them virtuous. But why not reverse this order? Why not make them first happy and then virtuous? If happiness and virtue be inseparable, the end will as certainly be attained by one method as by the other, and it is most undoubtedly much easier to contribute to the happiness and comfort of persons in a state of poverty and misery than, by admonitions and punishments, to improve their morals. He applied these principles to his miserable material with complete success, and referring to the result, exclaims, "Would to God that my success might encourage others to follow my example." Further examination of his proceedings shows that, in order to follow such example, a knowledge of first principles and a determination to carry them out in bold defiance of vulgar ignorance, general prejudice, and, vilest of all, polite sneering, is necessary. Having captured the beggars thus cleverly, he proceeded to carry out the above-stated principle by taking them to a large building already prepared, where everything was done that could be devised to make them really comfortable. The first condition of such comfort, he maintains, is cleanliness, and his dissertation on this, though written so long ago, might be quoted in letters of gold by our sanitarians of today. Describing how he carried out his principles, he says of the prisoners thus captured, "Most of them had been used to living in the most miserable hovels, in the midst of vermin and every kind of filthiness, or to sleep in the streets and under the hedges, half naked and exposed to all the inclemencies of the seasons. A large and commodious building, fitted up in the neatest and most comfortable manner, was now provided for their reception. In this agreeable retreat they found spacious and elegant apartments, kept with the most scrupulous neatness, well warmed in winter and well lighted, a good warm dinner every day, gratis, cooked and served up with all possible attention to order and cleanliness, materials and utensils for those that were able to work, masters gratis for those who required instruction, the most generous pay, in money, for all the labor performed, and the kindest usage from every person, from the highest to the lowest, belonging to the establishment. Here in this asylum for the indigent and unfortunate, No ill usage, no harsh language is permitted. During 5 years that the establishment has existed, not a blow has been given to anyone, not even to a child by his instructor. This appears like the very expensive scheme of a benevolent utopian, but, to set my readers at rest on this point, I will anticipate a little by stating that, although at first some expense was incurred, all this was finally repaid, and at the end of 6 years there remained a net profit of 100,000 florins, after expenses of every kind, salaries, wages, repairs, etc., had been deducted. When will our workhouses be administered with similar results? I must not dwell upon his devices for gradually inveigling the lazy creatures into habits of industry, for he understood human nature too well to adopt the jailer's theory, which assumes that every able-bodied man can do a day's work daily, in spite of previous habits. Rumford's patients became industrious ultimately, but were not made so at once. This development of industry was one of the elements of financial and moral success, and the next in importance was the economy of the commissariat, which depended on Rumford's skillful cookery of the cheapest viands, rendering them digestible, nutritious, and palatable. Had he adopted the dietary of an English workhouse or an English prison, his financial success would have been impossible, and his patients would have been no better fed, nor better able to work. The staple food was what he called a soup, but I find, on following out his instructions for making it, that I obtain a porridge rather than a soup. He made many experiments, and says, I constantly found that the richness or quality of a soup depended more upon a proper choice of the ingredients, and a proper management of fire in the combination of these ingredients, than upon the quantity of solid nutritious matter employed, much more upon the art and skill of the cook than upon the sum laid out in the market. Our vegetarian friends will be interested in learning that at first he used meat in the soup provided for the beggars, but gradually omitted it, and the change was unnoticed by those who ate, and no difference was observable as regards its nutrition value. In 1790, little or rather nothing was known of the chemistry of food. Oxygen had been discovered only 16 years before, and chemical analysis, as now understood, was an unknown art. In spite of this, Rumford selected as the basis of his soup just that proximate element which we now know to be one of the most nutritious that he could have obtained from either the animal or vegetable kingdom, viz. Casein. He not only selected this, but he combined it with those other constituents of food which our highest refinements of modern practical chemistry and physiology have proved to be exactly what are required to supplement the casein and constitute a complete dietary. By selecting the cheapest form of casein and the cheapest sources of the other constituents, he succeeded in supplying the beggars with good hot dinners daily at the cost of less than 1/2 penny each. The cost of the mess for the Bavarian soldiers under his command was rather more, viz. 2 pence daily, 3 farthings of this being devoted to pure luxuries such as beer, etc. Some of his chemical speculations, however, have not been confirmed. The composition of water had just been discovered, and he found by experience that a given quantity of solid food was more satisfying to the appetite, and more effective in nutrition when made into soup by long boiling with water. This led him to suppose that the water itself was decomposed by cookery, and its elements recombined or united with other elements, and thus became nutritious by being converted into the tissues of plants and animals. Thus, speaking of the barley which formed an important constituent of his soup, he says, "It requires, it is true, a great deal of boiling, but when it is properly managed it thickens a vast quantity of water, and, as I suppose, prepares it for decomposition." We now know that this idea of decomposing water by such means is a mistake, but in my own opinion there is something behind it which still remains to be learned by modern chemists. In my endeavors to fathom the rationale of these changes which occur in cookery, I have been, as my readers will remember, continually driven into hypotheses of hydration, i.e. of supposing that some of the water used in cookery unites to form true chemical compounds with certain of the constituents of the food. As already stated, when I commenced this subject, I had no idea of its suggestiveness, of the wide field of research which it has opened out. One of these subjects of research is the determination of the nature of this hydration of cooked gelatin, fibrin, cellulose, casein, starch, legumin, etc. That water is with them when they are cooked is evident enough, but whether that water is brought into actual chemical combination with them, in such wise as to form the new compounds of additional nutritive value, proportionate to the chemical addition of water, demands so much investigation that I have been driven to merely theorize where I ought to have demonstrated. The fact that the living body, which our food is building up and renewing, contains about 80% of water, some of it combined, some of it uncombined, has a notable bearing on the question. We may yet learn that hydration and dehydration have more to do with the vital functions than has hitherto been supposed. The following are the ingredients used by Rumford in soup number 1. 4 virtals of pearl barley equal to about 20 1/3 gallons. Weight 141 pounds, 2 ounces. Cost 11 shillings, 7 1/2 pence. 4 virtals of peas, weight 131 pounds, 4 ounces, cost 7 shillings 3 1/4 pence. Cuttings of fine wheaten bread, weight 69 pounds, 10 ounces, cost 10 shillings 2 1/4 pence. Salt, weight 19 pounds, 13 ounces, cost 1 shilling 2 1/2 pence. 24 mass, very weak beer, vinegar, or rather small beer turned sour, about 24 quarts, weight 46 pounds, 13 ounces, cost 1 shilling 5 1/2 pence. Water, about 560 quarts, weight 1,077 pounds, 0 ounces, cost none. Total weight 1,485 pounds, 10 ounces, total cost 1 pound, 11 shillings, 9 pence. Fuel, 88 pounds dry pine wood. Cost, 2 1/4 pence. Wages of 3 cookmaids at 20 florins a year each. Cost, 3 2/3 pence. Daily expense of feeding the 3 cookmaids at 10 kreutzers, 3 2/3 pence sterling each according to agreement. Cost, 11 pence. Daily wages of 2 men servants. Cost, 1 shilling 7 1/4 pence. Repairs of kitchen furniture, 90 florins per annum daily. Cost, 5 1/2 pence. Total daily expenses when dinner is provided for 1,200 persons, 1 pound, 15 shillings 2 2/3 pence. This amounts to 422 over 1,200, or a trifle more than 1/3 of a penny for each diner of this number 1 soup. The cost was still further reduced by the use of the potato, then a novelty, concerning which Rumford makes the following remarks, now very curious. So strong was the aversion of the public, particularly the poor, against them at the time when we began to make use of them in the public kitchen of the House of Industry in Munich, that we were absolutely obliged, at first, to introduce them by stealth. A private room in a retired corner was fitted up as a kitchen for cooking them, and it was necessary to disguise them by boiling them down entirely, and destroying their form and texture to prevent their being detected. The following are the ingredients of soup number 2, with potatoes. 2 virtals of pearl barley, weight 70 pounds, 9 ounces, cost 5 shillings, 9 13 over 22 pence. 2 virtals of peas, weight 65 pounds, 10 ounces, cost 3 shillings, 7 5/8 pence. 8 virtals of potatoes, weight 230 pounds, 4 ounces, cost 1 shilling, 9 9/11 pence. Cuttings of bread, weight 69 pounds, 10 ounces, cost 10 shillings, 2 4/11 pence. Salt, 19 pounds, 13 ounces, cost 1 shilling, 2 1/2 pence. Vinegar, weight 46 pounds, 13 ounces, cost 1 shilling, 5 1/2 pence. Water, weight 982 pounds, 15 ounces. Fuel, servants, repairs, etc. as before, cost 3 shillings, 5 5/12 pence. Daily cost of 1,200 dinners, 1 pound, 7 shillings, 6 2/3 pence. This reduces the cost to a little above 1 farthing per dinner. In the essay from which the above is quoted, there is another account reducing all the items to what they would cost in London in November 1795, which raises the amount to 2 3/4 farthings per portion for number 1, and 2 1/2 farthings for number 2. In this estimate, the expenses for fuel, servants, kitchen furniture, etc., are stated at 3 times as much the cost at Munich, and the other items at the prices stated in the printed report of the Board of Agriculture of November 10th, 1795. But since 1795, we have made great progress in the right direction. Bread then cost 1 shilling per loaf, barley and peas about 50% more than at present, salt is set down by Rumford at 1 1/4 pence per pound, now about 1 farthing. Fuel was also dearer, but wages have risen greatly. As stated in money, they are about doubled. In purchasing power, i.e. real wages, they are threefold. Making all these allowances, charging wages at 6 times those paid by him, I find that the present cost of Rumford's number 1 soup would be a little over 1/2 penny per portion, and number 2 just about 1/2 penny. I here assume that Rumford's directions for the construction of kitchen fireplaces and economy of fuel are carried out. We are in these matters still a century behind his arrangements of 1790, and nothing short of a coal famine will punish and cure our criminal extravagance. The cookery of the above-named ingredients is conducted as follows. The water and pearl barley first put together in the boiler and made to boil. The peas are then added, and the boiling is continued over a gentle fire about 2 hours. The potatoes are then added, peeled, and the boiling is continued for about 1 hour more, during which time the contents of the boiler are frequently stirred about with a large wooden spoon or ladle in order to destroy the texture of the potatoes and to reduce the soup to one uniform mass. When this is done, the vinegar and salt are added, and last of all, at the moment that it is to be served up, the cuttings of bread. Number 1 is to be cooked for 3 hours without the potatoes. As already stated, I have found in carrying out these actions that I obtain a puree or porridge rather than a soup. I found the number 1 to be excellent, number 2 inferior. It was better when very small potatoes were used, as they became more jellied, and the puree altogether had less of the granular texture of mashed potatoes. I found it necessary to conduct the whole of the cooking myself. The inveterate kitchen superstition concerning simmering and boiling, the belief that anything rapidly boiling is hotter than when it simmers, and is therefore cooking more quickly, compels the non-scientific cook to shorten the tedious 3-hour process by boiling. This boiling drives the water from below, bakes the lower stratum of the porridge, and spoils the whole. The ordinary cook, were she at the strappado, or all the racks in the world, would not keep anything barely boiling for 3 hours with no visible result. According to her positive and superlative experience, the mess is cooked sufficiently in 1/3 of the time, as soon as the peas are softened. She don't, and she won't, and she can't, and she shan't, understand anything about hydration. When it's done, and there's an end to it, and what more do you want? Hence the failures of the attempts to introduce Rumford's porridge in our English workhouses, prisons, and soup kitchens. I find when I make it myself that it is incomparably superior and far cheaper than the skilly at present provided, though the sample of skilly that I tasted was superior to the ordinary slop. The weight of each portion as served to the beggars, etc., was 19.9 ounces, 1 Bavarian pound. The solid matter contained was 6 ounces of number 2, or 4 3/4 ounces of number 1, and Rumford states that this is quite sufficient to make a good meal for a strong, healthy person, as abundantly proved by long experience. He insists again and again upon the necessity of the 3 hours cooking, and I am equally convinced of its necessity, though, as above explained, not on the same theoretical grounds. No repetition of his experience is fair unless this be attended to. I have no hesitation in affirming that the 4 3/4 ounces of number 1, when thus boiled for 3 hours, will supply more nutriment than 6 ounces boiled only 1½ hour. The bread should not be cooked, but added just before serving the soup. In reference to this he has published a very curious essay entitled On the Pleasure of Eating and the Means that may be employed for increasing it. Rumford used wood as fuel, and his kitchen ranges were constructed of brickwork with a separate fire for each pot, the pot being set in the brickwork immediately above the fireplace, in such manner that the flame and heated products of combustion surrounded the pot on their way to the exit flue. The quantity of fuel was adjusted to each operation, and with wood embers a long sustained moderate heat was easily obtained. With coal fires, such separate firing would be troublesome, as coal cannot be so easily kindled on requirement as wood. With our roaring, wasteful kitchen furnaces, and still more wasteful cooks, the long-sustained moderate heat is not practicable without some further device. I found that by using a milk scalder, which is a water bath similar to a glue pot, but on a large scale, I could obtain Rumford's results over a common kitchen range with very little trouble, and no risk of baking the bottom part of the porridge. I further found that even a longer period of stewing than he prescribes is desirable. I made a hearty meal on number 1 soup, and found it as satisfactory as any dinner of meat, potatoes, etc., of any number of courses, and, as a chemist, I assert without any hesitation that such a meal is demonstrably of equal or superior nutritive value to an ordinary Englishman's slice of beef diluted with potatoes. The number 2 soup is not so satisfactory. Rumford was wrong in his estimate of the value of potatoes. In the formula for Rumford's soup, it is stated that the bread should not be cooked, but added just before serving the soup. Like everything else in his practical programs, this was prescribed with a philosophical reason. His reasons may have been fanciful sometimes, but he never acted stupidly, as the vulgar majority of mankind usually do when they blindly follow an established custom, without knowing any reason for so doing, or even attempting to discover a reason. In his essay on the pleasures of eating, and of the means that may be employed for increasing it, he says, "The pleasure enjoyed in eating depends, first, on the agreeableness of the taste of the food, and secondly, upon its power to affect the palate. Now, there are many substances extremely cheap, by which very agreeable tastes may be given to food, particularly when the basis or nutritive substance of the food is tasteless, and the effect of any kind of palatable solid food, of meat for instance, upon the organs of taste may be increased almost indefinitely by reducing the size of the particles of such food, and causing it to act upon the palate by a larger surface, and if means be used to prevent it being swallowed too soon, which may easily be done by mixing it with some hard and tasteless substance, such as crumbs of bread rendered hard by toasting, or anything else of that kind, by which a long mastication is rendered necessary, the enjoyment of eating may be greatly increased and prolonged. He adds that the idea of occupying a person a great while, and affording him much pleasure at the same time in eating a small quantity of food, may perhaps appear ridiculous to some, but those who consider the matter attentively will perceive that it is very important. It is perhaps as much so as anything that can employ the attention of the philosopher. Further on he adds, if a glutton can be made to gourmandize 2 hours upon 2 ounces of meat, it is certainly much better for him than to give himself an indigestion by eating 2 pounds in the same time. This is amusing as well as instructive. So also are his researches into what I may venture to describe as the specific sapidity of different kinds of food, which he determined by diluting or intermixing them with insipid materials, and thereby ascertaining the amount of surface over which they might be spread before their particular flavor disappeared. He concluded that a red herring has the highest specific sapidity, i.e. the greatest amount of flavor in a given weight of any kind of food he had tested, and that, comparing it on the basis of cost for cost, its superiority is still greater. He tells us that the pleasure of eating depends very much indeed upon the manner in which the food is applied to the organs of taste, and that he considers it necessary to mention, even to illustrate in the clearest manner, every circumstance which appears to have influence in producing these important effects. As an example of this, I may quote his instructions for eating hasty pudding. The pudding is then eaten with a spoon, each spoonful of it being dipped into the sauce before it is carried to the mouth, care being had in taking it up to begin on the outside, near the brim of the plate, and to approach the center by regular advances, in order not to demolish too soon the excavation which forms the reservoir for the sauce. His solid Indian corn pudding is, in like manner, to be eaten with a knife and fork, beginning at the circumference of the slice, and approaching regularly towards the center, each piece of pudding being taken up with the fork and dipped into the butter, or dipped into it in part only before it is carried to the mouth. As a supplement to the cheap soup recipes, I will quote one which Rumford gives as the cheapest food, which in his opinion can be provided in England. Take of water 8 gallons, mix it with 5 pounds of barley meal, boil it to the consistency of a thick jelly. Season with salt, vinegar, pepper, sweet herbs, and 4 red herrings pounded in a mortar. Instead of bread, add 5 pounds of Indian corn made into samp, and stir it together with a ladle. Serve immediately in portions of 20 ounces. Samp is said to have been invented by the savages of North America who have no corn mills. It is Indian corn deprived of its external coat by soaking it 10 or 12 hours in a lixivium of water and wood ashes. This coat or husk, being separated from the kernel, rises to the surface of the water while the grain remains at the bottom. The separated kernel is stewed for about 2 days in a kettle of water placed near the fire. When sufficiently cooked, the kernels will be found to be swelled to a great size and burst open, and this food, which is uncommonly sweet and nourishing, may be used in a great variety of ways, but the best way of using it is to mix it with milk, and with soups and broths as a substitute for bread. He prefers it to bread because it requires more mastication, and consequently tends to prolong the pleasure of eating. The cost of this soup he estimates as follows: 5 pounds barley meal at 1.5 pence per pound, or 5 shillings 6 pence per bushel, 7.5 pence. 5 pounds Indian corn at 1.5 pence per pound, 6.25 pence. 4 red herrings, 3 pence. Vinegar, 1 pence. Salt, 1 pence. Pepper and sweet herbs, 2 pence. Total cost, 1 shilling 8 3/4 pence. This makes 64 portions, which thus cost rather less than 1/3 of a penny each. As prices were higher than now, it comes down to little more than 1 farthing, or 1/3 of a penny, as stated, when cost of preparation and making on a large scale is included. I have not been successful in making this soup, failed in the samp, as explained in the footnote. By substituting raspings, the coarse powder rasped off the surface of rolls or over-baked loaves, or breadcrumbs browned in an oven, I obtain a fair result for those who have no objection to a diffused flavor of red herring. By using grated cheese instead of the herring, as well as substituting breadcrumbs or raspings for the Indian corn, I have completely succeeded, but for economy and quality combined, the No. 1 soup, as supplied at Munich, is preferable. The feeding of the Bavarian soldiers is stated in detail in Volume 1 of Rumford's Essays. I take one characteristic example. It is from an official report on experiments made in obedience to the orders of Lieutenant General Count Rumford by Sergeant Wickelhoff's mess in the 1st Company of the 1st, or Elector's Own, Regiment of Grenadiers at Munich. June 10th, 1795. Bill of Fare. Boiled beef with soup and bread dumplings. Details of the expense. First, for the boiled beef and the soup. 2 pounds, 0 loths of beef, 16 kreutzers. 1 loth of sweet herbs, 1 kreutzer. 1/4 loth of pepper, half kreutzer. 6 loths of salt, half kreutzer. 14.5 loths of ammunition bread cut fine, 2 7/8 kreutzers. 9 pounds 20 loths of water, 0 kreutzers. Total weight, 13 pounds 9 3/4 loths. Cost, 20 7/8 kreuzers. The Bavarian pound is a little less than 1 1/4 pounds and is divided into 32 lots. All these were put in an earthenware pot and boiled for 2 hours and a quarter, then divided into 12 portions of 26 7/12 lots each, costing 1 3/4 kreuzers. Second, for the bread dumpling. 10 pounds 13 lots fine semmel bread, 10 kreuzers. 1 pound 0 lots of fine flour, 4 1/2 kreuzers. 6 lots of salt, half a kreutzer. 3 pounds of water, 0 kreuzers. Total weight, 5 pounds 19 lots. Total cost, 15 kreuzers. This mass was made into dumplings, which were boiled half an hour in clear water. Upon taking them out of the water, they were found to weigh 5 pounds 24 lots, giving 15 1/3 lots to each portion, costing 1 1/4 kreutzer. The meat, soup, and dumplings were served all at once in the same dish, and were all eaten together at dinner. Each member of the mess was also supplied with 10 lots of rye bread, which cost 5/16 of a kreutzer. Also with 10 lots of the same for breakfast, another piece of same weight in the afternoon, and another for his supper. A detailed analysis of this is given, the sum total of which shows that each man received an avoirdupois weight daily: 2 pounds, 2 34/100 ounces of solids, 1 pound, 2 84/100 ounces of prepared water, total weight 3 pounds, 15 18/100 ounces of total solids and fluids, which cost 5 17/48 kreuzers, or 2 pence sterling, very nearly. Other bills of fare of other messes, officially reported, give about the same. This is exclusive of the cost of fuel, etc. for cooking. All who are concerned in soup kitchens or other economic dietaries should carefully study the details supplied in these essays of Count Rumford. They are thoroughly practical, and, although nearly a century old, are highly instructive at the present day. With their aid, large basins of good nutritious soup might be supplied at 1 penny per basin, leaving a profit for establishment expenses, and if such were obtainable at Billingsgate, Smithfield, Leadenhall, Covent Garden, and other markets in London and the provinces, where poor men are working at early hours on cold mornings, the dram drinking which prevails so fatally in such places would be more effectually superseded than by any temperance missions, which are limited to mere talking. Such soup is incomparably better than tea or coffee. It should be included in the bill of fare of all the coffee palaces and such like establishments. Since the above appeared in Knowledge, I have had much correspondence with ladies and gentlemen who are benevolently exerting themselves in the good work of providing cheap dinners for poor school children and poor people generally. I may mention particularly the Reverend W. Moore Eade, rector of Gateshead on Tyne, a pioneer in the penny dinner movement, and who has published a valuable penny tract on the subject, Cheap Food and Cheap Cookery, which I recommend to all his fellow workers. He supplies distribution copies at 6 pence per 100. His penny dinner cooker, now commercially supplied by Messrs. Walker and Emley, Newcastle, overcomes the difficulties I have described in the slow cookery of Rumford soup. It is a double vessel on the glue pot principle, heated by gas. End of section 15. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio.